In this video lecture, we're going to look at the hypothalamic-pituitary axis. That is, how the hypothalamus and pituitary glands control a lot of the endocrine system. And we'll go through a lot of hormones, and so for each hormone, try to keep in mind what's going on with that hormone. That is, what is its function, what effect it has on the target organ, what are the target organs, which gland secretes that hormone, and then how is the levels of that hormone regulated. We'll spend quite a bit of time also looking at the details of how the hypothalamus and pituitary gland are related, and then of course we want to make sure we differentiate between what are the anterior pituitary hormones and what are the posterior pituitary hormones. So the pituitary gland has been called the master gland. It secretes 6 different hormones, and these hormones are all tropic, or most of them I should say, are tropic hormones. And so they're going to end up causing the release of other hormones, so in that sense it affects virtually all systems of our body. But however, I want you to think that the hypothalamus is the king behind the throne, or the power behind the throne, because it releases tropic hormones controlling the release of anterior pituitary hormones. And so we can see this relationship in the picture here, where here's the hypothalamus, again releasing hormones or tropic hormones that affect the anterior pituitary in releasing its hormones. Or it could send inhibitory hormones, turning the pituitary off, and therefore not releasing its hormones to its target organs. The hypothalamus has 3 different functions. One is that it's secretion of the regulatory hormones, so those releasing or tropic hormones that go to the anterior pituitary gland and cause the anterior pituitary gland to release its hormones and then affect other endocrine organs. It also produces 2 hormones itself, ADH or antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. These are actually produced in the hypothalamus and then are released in the posterior pituitary. And then last, of course, the hypothalamus controls much of the sympathetic output, particularly to the adrenal medulla, since we have that neural connection to the adrenal medulla and the secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine. The pituitary gland is situated right below the hypothalamus. So again, here's the hypothalamus, here's the pituitary gland here. Now the pituitary gland is divided into 2 glands. So again, it's one of those organs that may generally be called one organ, pituitary gland, but really it's two organs in one. So we have the anterior pituitary here and the posterior pituitary here. The anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis, or adenohypophysis. Adeno refers to glands. Hypophysis is another name for the pituitary gland, where hypophysis actually means to grow under. So, for example, it grows under the hypothalamus. So the adenohypophysis, or anterior pituitary, produces a wide range of hormones that are listed here, and then the target organs that those hormones affect are listed or shown next to those hormones. The posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. The neurohypophysis would refer to nerve. Hypophysis again refers to the pituitary. Here the posterior pituitary doesn't make these hormones. Remember, these hormones are made in the hypothalamus, but this posterior pituitary is in charge of releasing these 2 hormones to circulation. And then we can see here their target organs respectively. And we'll go through each one of these in more detail. So let's first start with the posterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus, again, makes these and releases the hormones into the posterior pituitary, and then the posterior pituitary then releases them into circulation, which you can see here in this picture. Here the hypothalamic neurosecretory cells produce the hormone. They get stored in a sense in the posterior pituitary, and then when the posterior pituitary, the hormones are released into circulation and end up traveling to their target organs or throughout the body and affecting those target organs. There are 2 posterior pituitary hormones. One is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, also referred to as vasopressin. The job of the anterior ADH, or the antidiuretic hormone, is to decrease the amount of water loss in the kidneys. So think of the term antidiuretic. If a patient takes a diuretic, they pee a lot. So an antidiuretic would prevent pee. So in other words, you're going to reabsorb a lot of that water. This hormone is inhibited by alcohol consumption. So if you're out drinking a bunch of beer one night, that's why you keep having to go to the bathroom throughout the night, because all that alcohol inhibits ADH. So since you don't have ADH in circulation, you end up peeing a lot because you don't have that antidiuretic effect. Also, that's the problem with hangovers, is more of not the toxicity of the alcohol as much as it is the dehydration caused by the inhibition of the ADH. Oxytocin is in charge of stimulating uterine contractions during delivery. It also promotes ejection of milk, or what's called the letdown reflex. That is when a baby starts to suckle on the breast, sensory impulses are sent back to the brain, and then that triggers the release of oxytocin to cause muscle contraction to allow milk to be ejected from the breast for the baby to feed on. Now, Pitocin is a drug, or a synthetic oxytocin, that's used to induce labor. So if you are late, or actually the baby is late, like my daughter, who was 16 days late, they induced her, or I call it, they evicted her, because they gave me injections of Pitocin to start the uterine contractions and get her going, get the labor going, and get her out of me. Yeah. It's not fun, ladies in the room. It's not a fun way to have go through labor, because you skip all the easiest stuff and start with heavy labor from the get-go. Diabetes insipidus is a condition where we have low production or lack of ADH. Now, diabetes actually means that you're urinating or peeing a lot. Insipidus then is not diabetes mellitus. This is a different condition. So your kidneys have an inability to respond to ADH. So if they can't respond to ADH, then you end up having a lot of urine production. Symptoms are very similar to those we see with diabetes mellitus. We have thirst, because you're peeing a lot, you're going to get dehydrated, so you thirst. Again, excess urine production, of course, but the difference between diabetes mellitus and insipidus is that in diabetes insipidus, there's no glucose in the urine. So you don't have the hyperglycemia, the high glucose levels in the blood, okay, that you see with diabetes mellitus. Now let's look at the anterior pituitary lobe and the hormones related to it. Again, a lot of those hormones are controlled by cells releasing hormones from the hypothalamus, and so they release their hormones into the capillary beds associated with the hypothalamus. It travels to the anterior pituitary and then releases those releasing hormones into the anterior pituitary gland, so that those cells of the anterior pituitary can produce their hormones and release those into circulation. So in order to do that, then we really need two sets of capillaries, or we need what's called a portal system. So let's first look at what is a portal system. Now, we have two portal systems. One up here is the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. The other is the hepatic portal system that's connected with the liver and the gut. We'll do the hepatic portal system when we get to the digestive system. We want to concentrate on this one, the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. Now let's first look at what makes up our circulatory system, or the names of those blood vessels. A typical circulatory route, you have arteries taking blood away from the heart. They become smaller, called arterioles, and then finally capillaries, the smallest of the blood vessels. This is where all nutrient and gas exchange takes place. Those collect, forming venules, and then they collect up to make veins, and it's back to the heart. Okay, now typically if we didn't have this hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, basically the capillaries that are associated with the hypothalamus would pick up the hormones of the hypothalamus, and then it would have those hormones would have to travel through the veins, through your heart, to the lungs, through the heart again, out, and then some of them will go up to your head, some of them will go down here the rest of your body. The ones that manage to go up to your head then would go up here to the set of capillaries in the anterior pituitary and then release its hormones, those hypothalamic hormones, into the anterior pituitary, triggering the anterior pituitary to make its hormones and release those into circulation. Now that's really kind of a ridiculous route considering the anterior pituitary is right below the hypothalamus. I mean, this is a long route to go when you've got the organ, your target organ, right next to you. So that's kind of a silly thing. The other is, too, it's going to take a lot more hypothalamic hormone production to have an effect if we didn't have this portal system, because remember, as it goes through here, some of that releasing hormones from the hypothalamus will go up, some of them will go down the rest of the body. There's no target organs down here for the hypothalamic hormones, so it's kind of stupid for those hormones to travel down there. So instead we have a portal system. This is a really smart design. So if this is the hypothalamus, the hormones from the hypothalamus are released into the capillaries here. Those releasing hormones then just travel right to the anterior pituitary. They diffuse out of the capillaries, affecting the anterior pituitary. So it's right there. So I don't need as much, and the hormones from the hypothalamus aren't traveling as far. And we can see that here in this picture. So here the hormones of the hypothalamus are being released into the capillaries of the hypothalamus. Those hormones then travel through the portal vein to the capillaries in the anterior pituitary. The hormones diffuse out of those capillaries, affecting the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary to start producing their hormones. Those hormones then are picked up by the capillaries in the anterior pituitary, and they travel out in circulation to the rest of the body. So it makes really a good sense on how this system works to get those hypothalamic hormones right to their target organ, the anterior pituitary. So let's look at the anterior pituitary hormones, and this slide just briefly goes over all the hormones of the anterior pituitary, and then we'll tie in those the hypothalamic hormones as they come up. So first we have FSH and LH. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone. LH is luteinizing hormone. These guys are related to or affect the gonads. So that's our target organ here. For females, it's going to be about estrogen and progesterone. For males, it's all about testosterone. And then, of course, making the eggs and sperm. We'll spend a little bit of time on these guys, not a lot. We'll save a lot of it for when we cover reproductive system at the end of the semester. Growth hormone is another one of the anterior pituitary hormones. It has a lot of target organs, basically pretty much every tissue in our body. Primarily it's going to go to liver and other cells, but primarily the liver, who also makes another hormone called insulin growth factor. And so we'll look at its effects. And then other tissues to get protein synthesis, carbohydrate, lipid metabolism, basically for growth. Thyroid stimulating hormone affects the thyroid gland to produce its thyroid hormones, which are called thyroxine and triiodothyronine. Prolactin is another hormone, the anterior pituitary. This is one of the hormones that is not a tropic hormone. It has its effects on the breast for development and milk production. And then finally ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, again another tropic hormone that causes the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, one of the glucocorticoids. So notice out of all of these hormones of the anterior pituitary, all of them are in some way tropic hormones except prolactin. Now growth hormone is often not called a tropic hormone, even though it does cause the release of another hormone, so there by definition should be considered a tropic hormone, but you may not see it labeled that way. So now let's look at each one of these hormones in more detail. We're going to start with the growth hormone. Now again, growth hormones target organs, the liver, adipose tissue, and most other cells. In the liver, it's going to cause glycogen breakdown. We have a lot of glycogen stored up in our liver, and so that's going to be releasing that the glucose from the glycogen breakdown into the blood, so thereby increasing blood sugar levels. And so it also causes the liver to secrete insulin-like growth factor. Insulin-like growth factor, along with the growth hormone, has or enhances nutrient uptake by cells, so things like the cartilage and bone can grow, muscles and other organs can have protein synthesis and grow. Since they have more nutrients to take up, they have a better ability to reproduce or multiply through mitosis. So these hormones, the growth hormone or the insulin-like growth factor, are considered anabolic hormones. Remember, anabolic reactions are building reactions. So this is building. Anabolic refers to building, so we're building up tissue. For the growth hormone also has effect on adipose tissue. It gets the adipose tissue to break down, or lipolysis of of fats, releasing fatty acids into circulation. It also gets other tissues to decrease their glucose utilization, looking towards fats, the fatty acids that have been released, or even some proteins as an energy source. So, in other words, it's sparing glucose, so that GH, by utilizing fats, sparing the use of glucose for energy, we're sparing glucose or saving it for our brain, because our brain is a selfish organ. It needs glucose, and we don't want to use up all the glucose to grow and then not have any left for the brain. Also we can think of it as an anti-insulin effect. Remember, insulin, if you know anything about it, it lowers blood glucose levels. And again, here we're seeing an increase in blood glucose levels because of growth hormone. Now, growth hormone's kind of a tricky one on how it's regulated. It's got quite a fancy negative feedback system in operation. So the growth hormone release is controlled by two hormones of the hypothalamus: growth hormone releasing hormone and somatostatin, or growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Let's start here. We'll just say, let's say we have a high level of growth hormone releasing hormone. It has a positive effect on growth hormone, so the higher levels of GHRH you have, the higher levels of growth hormone that you have. That then, high levels of growth hormone mean liver and other tissues are going to release insulin-like growth factor, and of course it has its functional effects here. But insulin-like growth factor then is going to inhibit the release of growth hormone and GHRH from circulation. So if I have high levels of GHRH, I'm going to have high levels of GH. High levels of GH mean high levels of insulin-like growth factor. But high levels of insulin-like growth factor inhibit GHRH, so that means I have less GHRH. Less GHRH means less GH. Less GH means less insulin-like growth factor. Less insulin-like growth factor means less inhibition. That means I've got more GHRH. More GHRH I have, the more GH I have. The more GH I have, the more insulin growth factor I have, which means now I have more inhibition. Okay, see how that goes? Now, imagine at the same time going on, we also have the effects of somatostatin. Now, somatostatin inhibits the release of growth hormone. So, if I have, let's say, a lot of somatostatin, I'm going to really inhibit GH, which means I lower GH production. If I have less GH, I have less insulin-like growth factor. Now, insulin-like growth factor stimulates the release of somatostatin. So if I have less insulin-like growth factor, I have less stimulation for the release of somatostatin. Less somatostatin means, remember this is inhibitory, so less somatostatin means more growth hormone. The more growth hormone I have, the more insulin-like growth factor I have. The more of insulin-like growth factor I have, the more stimulation or production of somatostatin, which means now I have high levels of somatostatin, lots of inhibition on GH, so my GH levels go down. insulin-like growth factor goes down, which means less stimulation, which means less somatostatin, and again we keep going in a circle for that. So notice both these sides are going at the same time. It's not like one does it sometime, one does it the other time, but they're both going to be working at the same time, affecting the level of growth hormone. So growth hormone, because of the negative feedback that we have here, is held at a pretty constant level throughout the days and years of our life. However, certain things can trigger the release of more growth hormone, such as our circadian rhythms, stress, and cortisol and fasting. Those things can affect GH levels, but pretty much we're going to have constant levels of GH. Now, there are cases where we have imbalances of growth hormone, and these are listed here. First is gigantism. Gigantism is hypersecretion of GH during childhood. Since we have so much GH or too much GH being released, it has a large effect on those growth plates in our bones, and so therefore we have our bones growing very, very long, and so you get these huge, tall people like Andre the Giant here. If you remember him, he was actually a wrestler, and then of course was the giant in Princess Bride, one of the best movies ever. And so he shows signs of growth of gigantism. He was like 7 foot tall. He was huge. That differs from acromegaly. Acromegaly is hypersecretion of growth hormone during adulthood. And this occurs, again, if it occurs during adulthood, you don't have your growth plates anymore, so you're not going to get increase in size. You're not going to grow taller as an adult because your bones are sealed, they can't grow anymore. But what you do get is seen down here is a change in growth in the bone width. They'll grow out, and so you can see here changes in the shape of this man's face as he progressed with this acromegaly. So much more pronounced forehead, more pronounced jaw and cheeks, and that type of thing. Both of these, gigantism and acromegaly, are often due to a tumor in the anterior pituitary, and those tumor cells are the cells that are responsible for making growth hormone, and therefore you end up with this hypersecretion of growth hormone. The opposite of those, of course, is the pituitary dwarfism, which would be hyposecretion or low production of growth hormone, and this results in a person being of short stature. And the only picture I could think of kind of relating this, of course, is from Wizard of Oz and some of the Munchkins. Now, this type of dwarfism is different from the one called achondroplasia. Achondroplasia is the genetic dwarfism that you see in things like the shows like Little People, Big World. In pituitary dwarfism, what you've got is just a short person. Their body proportions are normal, just everything's smaller. Whereas in achondroplasia, again, this is more a genetic condition where the arms and legs are shorter. The trunk is about normal. There are some spinal issues related to achondroplasia, that the curvatures are a little bit more extreme, but otherwise their trunk is normal length, but their arms and legs are much shorter, and that's what gives them their short dwarf appearance. The next hormone we'll look at is thyroid stimulating hormone. Again, this is an anterior pituitary hormone. It's a tropic hormone because its target is the thyroid gland, and it causes the thyroid gland to develop and to secrete its thyroid hormones. And so we can see here now, here's the thyroid stimulating hormone here. Its release is regulated by a hypothalamic hormone called thyroid releasing hormone, which you can see written down at the bottom. So if we have high levels of TRH, that means we have high levels of TSH. High levels of TSH means high levels of thyroid hormone. High levels of thyroid hormone inhibits the release of TRH and TSH. So now if I have lots of thyroid hormone, I have lots of inhibition, which means TRH levels go down, which also means then that TSH levels go down. If we have less TSH, we have less thyroid hormone being produced, which means less inhibition. Now I have more thyroid releasing hormone, more TSH, more thyroid hormone, More inhibition means the little TRH levels go down and we keep circling around again. Another anterior pituitary hormone is the adrenocorticotropic hormone, long name, but break it down. Notice adrenocortical refers to the adrenal gland, the cortical, the cortex of the adrenal gland. It's a tropic hormone, sometimes referred just in short as corticotropin, same thing as ACTH. Again, it's a tropic hormone. Its target, again, is the adrenal cortex, and it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release the glucocorticoid hormone, specifically cortisol. So here we can see it here. Now they flip the gland around, so here's the anterior pituitary on this side. Its release is controlled by a hormone in the hypothalamus called the corticotropin releasing hormone. So high levels of this hormone means high levels of ACTH. High levels of ACTH mean then high release of cortisol. Cortisol inhibits the release of CRH and ACTH. So if I have lots of cortisol, it means I have less CRH and less ACTH. Less CRH means lower ACTH, which means less cortisol. Less cortisol means less inhibition and therefore higher levels of CRH. And it's the same pattern that we've seen in other hormones. Now CRH, ACTH, and glucocorticoid levels can fluctuate through the day. The levels are highest in the morning, and then as the glucocorticoids rise, of course, that's going to cause a reduction in ACTH. Other things can also affect levels of all of these hormones, like fever, hypoglycemia, and stressors, and we'll come back to that again when we cover cortisol in the next video lecture, because I want you to think of cortisol as our stress hormone. When we're under stress, we release a great deal of cortisol. Now the gonadotropins are FSH and LH, or follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with those here, but we'll look at them in more detail when we do reproductive system. The target organ, of course, the testes and ovaries. FSH is responsible for sperm or egg production, where LH is responsible for gonad hormones, either testosterone or estrogen and progesterone in females. The release of LH and FSH are controlled by gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is a hypothalamic hormone. So again, high levels of GnRH means high levels of FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary. That in males then affects testosterone, meaning you have high levels of testosterone. Testosterone inhibits the release of GnRH and LH, or FSH and LH. So high levels of testosterone mean low GnRH. Low GnRH means lower levels of FSH and LH, which means lower levels of testosterone. Lower levels of testosterone mean less inhibition of GnRH, which means then more GnRH, which means higher FSH and LH, higher testosterone. Same pattern we've seen before. Now, of course, this is with the male. The female's hormone cycles are much more complicated than this and fluctuate quite a bit during the monthly cycle. So again, we're saving that for reproductive system. The last hormone of the anterior pituitary that we'll look at is prolactin. Now, prolactin is not one of the tropic hormones. Its target organ is the breast. It functions to cause mammary gland development and primarily production of milk. Its regulation is through a hormone called prolactin inhibiting hormone of the hypothalamus, which is also the same thing as dopamine, one of the neurotransmitters we find in the brain. What we find is rising estrogen levels during our menstrual periods, or our monthly menstrual cycle, I should say, increased prolactin secretion, and so right before you maybe end up menstruating, you have high levels of estrogen, and that's going to trigger prolactin, and that's what actually can cause breast tenderness right before and during menstruation. Its trigger, though, is nursing, that is while the breasts have developed because of oxytocin, which I'll come back to in a little bit, during pregnancy, and actually during prolactin during pregnancy, you get milk production. So what happens basically is this. Imagine a baby suckling on the breast. It gets some mechanoreceptors in the nipple to send sensory impulses to the brain. Now the brain then is going to inhibit PIH, or the prolactin inhibiting hormone. Remember, this is going to inhibit the production of prolactin, so we're going to inhibit it. So inhibiting inhibitory hormone means I'm going to end up making lots of prolactin. Lots of prolactin means I make more milk, okay? And therefore, I have plenty of milk for the baby. Now, if you remember oxytocin, which they also drew in there, but oxytocin, remember, is a posterior pituitary hormone. Oxytocin is for the milk letdown. So again, when the baby starts to suckle, those impulses, or the sensory impulses from that, go up to the higher brain centers and are positive effect on the hypothalamus to produce oxytocin, released through the posterior pituitary, so you increase oxytocin. That causes smooth muscle contractions to allow for milk ejection or letdown, and so the baby gets his or her milk. Sometimes the sound or cry of a baby can actually trigger the oxytocin to be released, and you have milk letdown. So some women who are nursing will hear somebody else's baby cry, and all of a sudden, boom, your bra's wet. It's fun, ladies. So that's going to end our video lecture on the hypothalamus and pituitary hormones. The next video lecture is going to look at all the other glands of the endocrine system and talk about their hormones and how they affect the functioning of the body.